Chapter 18. Michael lay awake most of the night, wondering how to break the news to Joe. Then, while the neighbor's cat foraged below his window for crickets in the early morning hours, Michael finally fell asleep, only to awaken a few hours later in sheets soaked with the sweat of his nightmares. That morning he called Joe and told him to meet him in the parking lot at the pool after work. If Joe was surprised or even curious, he didn't let on, simply saying that he'd be there. Michael had seen Joe only a few times since the day he had come by Michael's house to tell him how it had gone with the police. He wondered if Joe thought he was avoiding him, although Joe hadn't exactly been seeking him out either. But whatever was going on between them, Michael needed to believe he could still count on his friend. And sure enough, after work, he found Joe leaning against his red Mustang in the parking lot, arms folded, head tipped forward as if he were dozing. He wore a rolled-up blue bandana tied around his head, and a single skull earring danced in the late afternoon sunlight. "What's the deal?" he said when he saw Michael coming. "Not here," Michael told him. Joe eyed him intently, then shrugged. "So get in the car. We'll go wherever you want." Michael hadn't thought about going anywhere in the car. He hadn't set foot inside the Mustang since the day he failed his first driver's test. He felt his chest tighten as Joe opened the car door. His nerves on edge, he listened as the engine roared awake, bringing the radio on full blast. "I miss my CD player," Joe said when Michael finally managed to force himself into the passenger seat. Then he grinned. "Think the cops will ever find the guy who stole it?" When Michael didn't respond, Joe leaned down and pulled a can of beer from underneath the driver's seat. He tugged at the metal tab. The warm beer erupted into his hand like white lava. He chugged the entire can within seconds, crushed it beneath his foot, and tossed it under the car parked next to him. "Can't get caught with an open can in the car while I'm driving," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Rules are rules." Then he laughed. Michael was painfully aware that Joe was rarely without a can of beer in his hand these days, at least on those few occasions when he'd seen him. Before, he had drunk only at parties, but this was something new. If Michael allowed himself to think about it, which he tried not to, he would have to admit that Joe's drinking had gotten worse since they had learned about Charlie Ward's death. Joe shifted the car into reverse and backed out of the space. "So are we going to talk or what?" "Just drive," Michael told him. "Drive where?" "Anywhere. The swamp." For some reason he could not explain, Michael felt drawn to the great swamp that afternoon. And because it was a weekday, he knew not many people would be around. Joe parked the car, pulled an old backpack from the trunk, filled it with 3 cans of beer, and headed toward the first trail. Michael followed. In the past, he would have worried about being caught in the swamp with beer, but that didn't matter much now. He knew without asking where Joe was headed. So when they came to the bend in the trail that opened into a wide circle, he cupped a hand over his brow and stared up at the ghost tree, as if he had just run into an old friend he hadn't seen in years. The ground beneath the tree was completely bare. No ferns, no grass, not even weeds grew there. And in the middle, solemn and majestic, stood the ancient and enormous sycamore. Hazy sunlight spilled down between its leaves. It looked far from ghostly. He had heard once that the tree had gotten its name from the way it looked in the winter. Without its leaves, the thick, bare branches appeared smooth and white, like brittle bones reaching skyward. Ancient souls were said to dance around the tree at midnight whenever there was a full moon. But for all the spooky old legends, the tree had never seemed haunted to him, and he and Joe spent hundreds of hours beneath its branches. Funny, he hadn't thought about the ghost tree for years, except for that time in the park when he had met Joe to explain about the stolen gun story. Joe walked around to the other side of the circle where the path continued, and Michael followed. They had gone only a few yards when Joe stepped off the path into the woods, slapping branches out of the way. Michael knew Joe was headed for the pond, a special place they discovered years ago. Their sneakers made sucking sounds in the soft mud as they walked along. The pond was only 50 yards or so from the ghost tree, but when they were kids, it had seemed to take them hours to get there. Within minutes, they were They were clearing a space beneath a tree a few feet from the edge of the pond. It had been at least 3 years since they had come to this spot. Joe rubbed his back against the rough bark like a lazy bear, then slid comfortably to the ground. Michael sat beside him so that he would not have to look directly at his face. Through the branches, he could just make out the top of the ghost tree. He thought about the times he and Joe had dared each other to spend the night there alone. Kids were always daring each other to sleep in the ghost tree. They claimed that if you could survive the night there alone, you could survive anything. It had become a kind of rite of passage for some of them, although Michael had never actually met anyone who had done it. Joe took a beer from his backpack and offered it to Michael, who declined. "Okay, we're 10,000 miles from civilization," he said, yanking open the tab. "Now are you going to tell me what's going on?" "The cops were at my house last night," Michael said. "Again? Man, they never give up." Michael kept his eyes on the pond. On the other side, a large snapping turtle was slowly, laboriously pulling himself up onto the rock. They know the bullet came from the Winchester. At the corner of his eye, he saw a stream of beer escape from Joe's mouth as he suddenly jerked the can away. Joe grabbed his wet T-shirt, squeezing it with his hand. "Your Winchester? How do they know it's your Winchester?" Michael told him everything that had taken place the night before, how they had traced the bullet to his gun and had found the empty casing in the woods behind the house. He told him everything except that the suspicion had shifted to Joe. Joe finished the beer and opened another. "I keep telling you, man, they can't prove a damn thing without the rifle. If they don't have the murder weapon, they don't have a case." Dragonflies skimmed the surface of the pond. Michael picked up a flat stone and skipped it over the water. He had never felt so lost before. Always there was Joe. From the first time they met, even as small boys, he had known he could tell Joe anything, because Joe would not judge him. He would only listen. But that was not going to happen this time, and he knew, too, that no matter how all of this turned out, they would never come back to this place again. "You need to know something," he said quietly. Joe had leaned his head back against the tree and appeared to be dozing. Without opening his eyes, he said, "What's that?" The air felt so heavy, Michael thought he might drown if he took a breath. "Healy's got this idea that maybe you borrowed the rifle and then said it was stolen to cover up the fact you fired it." Joe's silence was deafening. It beat against Michael's ears until the ache crept into his skull. When Joe finally did speak, his voice was low. The words slipped from his tongue like slow drops from a leaking faucet. "Yeah, and where would he have gotten that idea?" Michael knew Joe was staring right at the side of his face.